Today is April 16th, 2023, but today something incredibly unusual happened. You'll see my mom's yellow rose of Texas that I got for her birthday still alive. It's got a little bit of wilting around some of the edges of the petals, and it's yellow, okay? So I have, in the past, in my own backyard for years, we had lilac bushes and we had yellow tiger swallowtail butterflies that would come. And I would chase around the yard trying to get it to land so I could take a photograph of it. In the last year that I was at the house before, unfortunately, it was sold, one of the big tiger swallowtails came and landed on a purple flower, and I got a picture of it, and it was the shot that I always wanted. But today, it was so nice out. I had put my shorts on. Now, mind you, we just had rain with a little bit of snow showers, not too much snow, but they were expecting a lot more snow to come down. So today I went up the pathway, and flying right towards me is a yellow tiger swallowtail butterfly. I was shocked. We don't have our last frost date until about May 15th. So March and April are the most snowiest months in Colorado. And that's because it becomes like a very wet, heavy spring snow. So we get a lot of accumulation usually in these months, and the weather is fluctuating, and we don't have a very long spring at all. So this yellow swallowtail came up, and I was so shocked. I was trying to get my cell phone up, but I was carrying a drink in my hand and a bag of chips, so I was trying to, put it down and capture the butterfly. Well, I put my hand up in the air like this because I was hoping it would come around my hand and land, and it did fly kind of around, but it went around me and then went up the pathway, and it landed up on this blue spruce somewhere within the tree, and I couldn't see where it went. Well, I kept looking for it, and I did manage to capture a clip of it, but then after that, a little tiny small butterfly was flying around these bushes that leaves just came out on, but the majority of trees have not leafed out yet. They're just starting to have buds, and some of the bushes are having leaves open. So I went and sat in the patio and then came back, and as I'm coming up the sidewalk again, the swallowtail came out of the bushes over to the right, and it flew around me and went down the sidewalk, and it came around, and I managed to get a clip of it coming towards me. And the only way I could really show you, because it went so fast, was I took some screenshots of my video. And of course it went so fast that it's kind of a little bit blurry. But for there to be a yellow tiger swallowtail butterfly today in mid-April is extremely strange and rare and unusual. And the fact that it's a yellow butterfly and my mom's rose is a yellow rose of Texas, I thought that was really neat. So I'll have to show you a couple of these pictures. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today was the stone of Scone that King Charles III will be seated above as he's coronated during his coronation ceremony May 6th. Now, as I've talked about before, it was Queen Victoria who said that their genealogical line went back to and was traced to King David, and that the throne of Judah would never be vacated. So what I want to propose is this. Is the stone of Scone that the English have been coronated sitting over, it sits in the slot in the throne chair, and it was taken, I believe it was Edward I took it from the Scots, and the Scots had all of their kings coronated sitting upon this stone. And it says, is the stone of Scone indeed the stone of Jacob, which Jeremiah brought to Ireland, and on which the British royalty has been coronated for so many centuries? Is there any way to verify these traditions, or will such an ancient claim remain forever impossible to verify? Well, let's look at the geological evidence. In the age of modern scholarship, it has become fashionable to demote all ancient history and tradition to the realm of legend, myth, and fantasy. In many cases, that is the throwing out the baby with the bathwater, because there's usually a core of truth handed down in legend. In preparing the article, browsing the web for the stone of Scone led to more articles ridiculing the traditions than those giving them any credence at all. Modern writers have assumed the stone of Scone must have originated from a local quarry. The article says, I am only aware of 2 scientific attempts to determine the origins of the stone. The first was by Professor Totten of Yale University in response to suggestions that it had come from a local quarry. He issued the statement, the analysis, he says, of the stone shows that there are absolutely no quarries in Scone or Iona, that's where all the Scottish kings were crowned, wherefrom a block so constituted could possibly have come, nor yet from Tara. And they say that name Tara comes from Torah. But the second study was done by Professor Odlum, who was a geologist and professor of theology at Ontario University. He made microscopic examinations of the stone, comparing it to quarries in both Scotland and Ireland, and found it dissimilar to stones from those areas. He became intrigued with the idea of that it might really be the stone of Jacob. That hypothesis could be tested scientifically by searching to see if a similar type of rock is found near Bethel, where Jacob found his stone. Now, Rabbi Chaim Richman had said that when Jacob took this stone to lay his head upon, it was actually a stone from the altar. And so you have to keep that in mind. After considerable researching, he found some strata rather high near a cliff that had exactly the type of composition he was looking for. He chipped off a piece and later performed microscopic tests. He concluded that his sample matched perfectly with the coronation stone. So what he's saying is he went to Bethel in Israel and chipped off a piece of the rock off this cliff at Bethel and brought it back to Britain and had it analyzed, and it matches perfectly with the stone of Scone. Desirous for even better proof, he sought to get a little piece the size of a pea from the coronation stone on which he could perform chemical tests. When he petitioned the Archbishop of Canterbury for such a piece, the reply was that it would take an act of Parliament signed by the king, and even then he wouldn't prove it. To the best of my knowledge, that was the end of a really fine scientific experiment, which could at least partially validate the claim that the stone might have come from Bethel. This is an excellent example of how science can indeed be used to validate historical traditions. They cannot provide proof, but can greatly add to the credibility of a story. What is needed now is a really thorough scientific study of the stone to verify its authenticity. Now here's the thing, some claim that the Scots hid the stone, the real stone, and somebody said it was buried in a cliff of a cave, and then it was forgotten where its location was because the English came into Scotland and invaded, and then the people were killed that hid the stone, so nobody could find where it had been hidden. But supposedly there was a boy that fell through the peat or something, and he saw the real stone in this cave. Now, they claim that Edward, I think it was Edward I, took the stone to England, and then the English kings and queens started coronating their kings and queens sitting upon the stone of Scone. So it's spelled like scone, like the Italian scone, but it's really pronounced Scone. So the conclusion was, preliminary geological studies have indicated that the stone of destiny upon which British monarchs have been crowned for centuries might indeed be the stone of Jacob, as tradition asserts, because it matches a formation near Bethel, the biblical location of the stone the prophet Jacob found. Further scientific testing is now required, such as a thorough chemical composition comparison, and even that can only confirm the possibility that the stone is authentic. In any case, when this was written, it was the 50th anniversary of the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. And we can pause to pay respect to what very well might be the continuation of the unbroken line of succession of the kings reigning over the children of Israel from King David over 3,000 years ago. And one of the points to consider is that David's promise of continually reigning descendants appears to be an extension of the same promise given to Judah. This article discusses the continuity of the regal line after David, but what about from Judah to David? Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and before that, Israel was ruled by judges from various tribes. Now, here's the interesting thing. I don't know if you are aware of this, but the whole dynamic and situation with what Benjamin Netanyahu is trying to do with the ultra-Orthodox Jews that are within his party, those were the two Jewish or ultra-Orthodox that wanted to eliminate Yeshua and Jesus and the gospel, but Netanyahu said no, once again, to them, putting their Antichrist bill through. But what I wanted to say is that it's been mentioned that they want to restore the biblical judges as it was in ancient times. So that is interesting that Israel was once ruled by judges from various tribes. Where were the kings from Judah at that time? A manuscript from the archives of Constantinople, which might well be the last chapter of the book of Acts, states that the Apostle Paul visited the British Isles, and that certain of the Druids came unto Paul privately, and showed by their rites and ceremonies they were descended from the Jews which escaped from bondage in the land of Egypt. And the apostle believed these things. And that's from a book by E. Raymond Capt, The Lost Chapter of Acts of the Apostles. And it says, if some Israelites escaped from Egypt as the bondage began, and there's this woman named Scotta She was supposed to be, I guess she was Pharaoh's daughter. I was trying to remember the story. There's one that had the daughters of Zedekiah, that it's actually in the Bible, that the daughters of the royalty fled with Jeremiah. They first went to MIZPAH, then they went to Egypt. God told them not to go to Egypt or they would be annihilated, but there would be a remnant that would escape. So there's this legend that they took a ship and they sailed across the Mediterranean Sea, and where they wound up was, I think they were blown off course, and they wound up on the shores of Ireland. And the other story about Scota was that she was the daughter of Pharaoh, and that Scotland was named after her, something to that effect. If some Israelites escaped from Egypt as the bondage began, then Judah's descendants could have a continual reign beginning with Judah himself. And of course, Jacob was renamed Israel, so the stone of Scone, being Jacob's pillow stone, would be the stone of Israel. And this is one of the many reasons why King Charles III could claim to be sitting on the throne of David, the stone of Israel, to become their king. And I'm not saying that that's going to happen right at the May 6th coronation. This could be something that comes after it, and events have to fall into place. But the Greek tradition is that Cecrops was the founder and first king of Athens, and that his brother Darda was the founder of Troy. Both were said to have come from Egypt. Some researchers have concluded that they were none other than the Kelkol and Dara, sons of Zerah, in 1 Chronicles 2:6. And Jacob's pillar. If so, it would mean that those cities were founded earlier than thought, and that the founders left before rather than after the Egyptian bondage. The Scottish tradition is that his people were officially named Scota in honor of his wife, although they also say that the name came from Scotia, their former home Scythia. The ancestor of the Scots was Ain Grec, call it Gathalus, father of Echad, son or descendant of Cecrops of Athens, Untherways of Argus, king of Argives, who came to Egypt when in this time reigned in Egypt Pharaoh. And this is written in Gaelic, kind of, so it's hard to read. But ye scourge of ye people of Israel, Gathalus gained a great victory for Pharaoh against the Moors and people of Yened, and King Pharaoh gave him his daughter, called Scota, in marriage. It explicitly states that after they moved to Lusitania, or Portugal, and built the city of Brigantes, that he called his subjects Scotus in honor and affection of his wife. That's from the Chronicles of Scotland by John Belladon. And it's quoted in Pillar of Jacob, page 30. Another regal line in England descending from David comes from Joseph of Arimathea, who went to England shortly after the crucifixion of Christ, and from whom King Arthur descended. According to Cap, page 26, after the fall of Troy, about 1200 BC, Aeneas, the last of the royal blood of Zerah, there was Pharez and Zerah. And it's very possible I could be descended from the line of Pharez, because of my mother's maiden name is very similar. And it's considered to be several spellings of the surname, including her surname. But The last of the royal blood of Zerah took what was left of his nation and moved to Italy. He married the daughter of Latinus, king of the Latins, and founded the Roman Empire. His son or grandson, Brutus, with a large party of Trojans, removed to England, and he arrived about 1103 BC and made a contract with his kindred in Britain. He built his new capital called Sierra Troia, or New Troy. The Romans later called it Londinium, and today it is known as London. And you can watch the CNN coverage of the return of the Stone of Scone to Scotland, where it is now housed in Edinburgh Castle, where the crown jewels of the Scottish kings resides. And Bethel was located within a few miles of what is now Ramallah, which is Yasser Arafat's headquarters formerly. Some possibilities are Exodus 17:6, Numbers 28, Deuteronomy 8:5, Psalm 114:8 in light of 1 Corinthians 10:4. So some of these traditions come through the Masons. So that's important to know. Because their whole goal all along was to rebuild Solomon's temple. And of course we know that there are Masons that have met in Zedekiah's cave. And this is why I believe that Ron Wyatt knew that the Ark of the Covenant was in that cave. So at least he's claiming that it was in there. And this is where the Masons met to have meetings. There are Masons of Jerusalem, and many of them are planning to rebuild Solomon's temple. Now the thing is that God destroyed that temple for a reason. There was corruption, there was idolatry brought in there, there was the abomination of idol images and them worshiping idols there. So God destroyed it. Now, the question is, in ancient times, there were a lot of seaports and routes. And basically, Solomon had the first navy there. And so he was a merchant by sea, a trader by sea. So at the time of the Apostle Paul, he was traveling by ship to Asia Minor, to many different ports and landing there. And we see in Romans 15 that Paul planned to visit Spain and Rome. A lot of people don't know this. So you have the Straits of Gibraltar that you have to go through to get to Ireland and Scotland. So I believe if they were blown off course, that they definitely could have landed, in a different place upon the shores of Ireland or Scotland when they took the stone with them. Now, during the Crusades, a lot of pieces of stone were taken from Jerusalem as treasures and taken back to some of the European countries and different castles. They would have a stone from Jerusalem. But now, let's look at Romans 15 about this. But now having no more place in these parts, now this is the Apostle Paul talking, and having a great desire these many years to come unto you, whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey, and to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company. But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints. For it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem. It hath pleased them verily, and their debtors they are. For if the Gentiles have been made partakers of their spiritual things, their duty is also to minister unto them in carnal things. Then therefore I have performed this, and have sealed to them this fruit. I will come by you into Spain, and I am sure that when I am come unto you, I shall come in the fullness of the blessing of the gospel of Christ. So we know that the Apostle Paul was traveling all around by ship, and that he was crossing the Mediterranean Sea, that he went to Rome, and he was said to have gone to Spain. So my point is that they were traveling that far via ship back then on the Mediterranean Sea. And if these people, Jeremiah's, the daughters of Zedekiah, survived, because some of the royalty, the daughters, were not taken to Babylon. They went to MIZPAH with the prophet Jeremiah, and then it was said that they fled from Egypt. And it could have been at that time that the stone was taken with them that was preserved as the royal stone of David, which was the stone of Jacob, Jacob's stone that he laid his head on when he had the vision of God ascending and descending. So this is what the royalty claim to be coronated upon. Now, I just want to give you some information about the Apostle Paul going to Spain, because it is said in Spain that he did come there, and they actually have a statue of the Apostle Paul in this specific town. So I was reading about Paul's plan to visit Spain and Rome in Romans 15, starting in verse 23 and going down through 29. So let's just look at Paul's missionary journey to Spain, tradition and folklore. The early church, and especially the church in Spain, has maintained various accounts of the missionary journey by the Apostle Paul to Spain. The official and popular traditions are described briefly, and before I read that, I want to tell you, one of the reasons why I'm telling you this is because there was this the Milesians were said to have come across with Scota, and I believe that they landed in Spain. There was a group of people that landed in Spain first, and then they went over to Scotland and Ireland. So it could have been that very time. I'm trying to piece this research together to give more verification of these stories as not just being legend or folklore. But if that's the case, and their ship came across the Mediterranean, and Paul was saying that he went to Spain or was going to go to Spain, then it's not far-fetched to believe that the earlier people came, like the daughter of Zedekiah, the daughters of Judah came and landed at Spain first, and then went through the Straits of Gibraltar to Scotland and Ireland. I can see how that very well could be. And then if Joseph of Arimathea later went to England, to Glastonbury, where there's this whole tradition of him being there, then it's very possible. So it says, we shall probably never know whether Paul fulfilled the intention expressed in his letter to the Romans to visit Spain. The early church believed that the apostles' appeal to Caesar terminated successfully, that he was acquitted of the charges against him, and that he spent some years in freedom before he was again imprisoned and sentenced to death. Now, this is speaking about the Apostle Paul. Eusebius writes that after pleading his cause, he is said to have been sent again upon the ministry of preaching, and after a second visit to the city, he finished his life with martyrdom. Evidence of Paul's activity subsequent to the 2 whole years mentioned in Acts 28:30 is found in 3 early Christian documents. In 96 AD, Clement of Rome, who tradition has identified as Paul's disciple, mentioned in Philippians 4:3, wrote an epistle to the Corinthians in which he states that Paul had been 7 times in bonds and had been driven into exile and been stoned, had preached in the East and in the West. He won the noble renowns, which was the reward of his faith, having taught righteousness into the whole world, and having reached the farthest bounds of the West. For a Roman, the, quote, farthest bounds of the West, end quote, a phrase often used by Roman writers to refer to Spain, could only mean the Iberian Peninsula. Further, the Acts of Peter, or Simon Peter, written in the late 2nd century, informs us in some detail about the departure of the Apostle Paul from the Roman harbor of Ostia to Spain. And lastly, the Muratori Canon, compiled by an anonymous Christian about 170 AD, refers to his Spanish mission. This document, originally written in Greek and translated into somewhat barbarous Latin, includes the following in its account of the Acts of the Apostles. Luke puts it shortly to the most excellent Theophilus that several things were done in his own presence, as he also plainly shows by leaving out the passion of Simon Peter and also the departure of Paul from town on his journey to Spain. By the middle of the 2nd century, Christians believed that the apostles' intended visit to Spain was in fact realized. This is not the place to discuss the manifold arguments for or against the apostles' journey to Spain. It is well known that later accounts of outstanding conquerors, missionaries, and other important personages show a tendency to exaggerate historical facts by representing the territorial extent of their influence as greater than it actually was. It is possible, therefore, that the tradition of Paul's mission to Spain is a mere extension of an intent. Treating the apostles' journey as an undoubted historical fact, John Chrysostom mentions that Paul, after his residence in Rome, departed to Spain, and Jerome states that the apostle reached Spain by sea. If Paul realized his plans to visit Spain, he would have considered his stay in Rome as a mere stopover for his mission to the west. In that case, the apostle would have left Rome by the Via Ostense to Ostia, the new port of Imperial Rome. Ostia harbor, begun by Claudius and dedicated as Portus Augusti by Nero in 54 AD, soon became one of the larger cosmopolitan and commercial centers in Italy, with more than 50,000 inhabitants. Every year on January 27th, large crowds from Rome gathered in Ostia for the celebrations in honor of Castor and Pollux. The Jewish community maintained a synagogue on the outer periphery of the city on the Via Severiana. The recently excavated synagogue in Ostia shows an elaborate vestibule leading to the main building, ending in a slightly curved apse. In the southern section was the tabernacle containing the scrolls of the Hebrew scriptures. One would not be surprised if Paul had visited and even preached in this synagogue. Now that's because he was a very high-class Torah scholar. He was a student of Rabbi Gamaliel, and he was one of the top educated scholarly Hebrew scholars in the temple in Jerusalem, and Paul was his student. Ostia had rapidly taken over the commerce of Puteoli, and most of the goods destined for Rome arrived in Ostia. According to Strabo, it was the port town of the Roman navy, the port into which the Tiber, after flowing past Rome, empties. Ships sailed regularly from Ostia to the Spanish ports of Cadiz in Tarraco or Tarragona, according to Pliny the Elder, who under the Emperor Vespasian served as procurator in Hispania, Tarraconensis. The journey from Ostia to Spain took 4 days. Now, what I find interesting about this is that it was the port at the time of Vespasian who, I'm trying to remember, but during the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD, it was Vespasian, I believe he was the father of Titus, if I can remember correctly, and he paraded the menorah and all of the things that are on the Arch of Titus in Rome. Vespasian was in that parade. And this is interesting. It says Vespasian served as the procurator in Hispania, Tarraconensis, which I just read. The journey from Ostia to Spain took 4 days. So, if the leader of Rome during the time of the sack of Jerusalem was the procurator in Spain there, then you know people were traveling a lot to these ports. So it says the 3rd chapter in the apocryphal Acts of Simon Peter describes in a vivid manner the departure of the Apostle Paul from Ostia harbor. A great multitude of women were kneeling and praying and beseeching Paul, and they kissed his feet and accompanied him unto the harbor. But Dionysius and Balbus of Asia, knights from Rome, and illustrious men, and a senator by name of Demetrius, abode by Paul on his right side, and said, Paul, I would desire to leave the city if I were not a magistrate, that I might not depart from thee. And also from Caesar's house, Cleobius and Aphitius, and Philostrate with Narcissus, the presbyter, accompanied him to the harbor. But whereas a storm of the sea came on, he, Narcissus, sent the brethren back to Rome, that if any would, he might come down and hear Paul until he set sail. And hearing that, the brethren went up into the city, and when they told the brethren that had remained in the city, some on beasts and some on foot, and others by way of the Tiber, came down to the harbor, and were confirmed in the faith for 3 days, and on the 4th until the 5th hour, praying together with Paul, and making the offering, and they put all that was needful on the ship, and delivered to him 2 young men, believers, to sail with him, and bade him farewell in the Lord, and returned to Rome. Tarragona would have been the most likely city for the apostles' mission to Spain, known as Colonia. Julius Vitrix Triumphalis Tarraco, to commemorate the victories of Julius Caesar. The city was made the seat of one of the 4 assize courts established in Hispania. Citerior, having spent some time in Tarragona, Augustus made it the capital of the whole province, subsequently named Hispania Tarraconensis. East of the site of the present cathedral, the people of Tarragona constructed an altar to Augustus. An 8th century Spanish tradition relates that during his mission to the Catalans, the Apostle Paul consecrated Prosperus first bishop of Tarragona because of intense local persecutions by the Romans. Prosperus fled to Rhegium, Lepidum, Reggio nell'Emilia, northwest of Bologna, where he was immediately accepted as bishop of the city because he is the successor of Paul in Tarragona. The 10th century Greek Menologian and the hagiographer Simeon Metaphrates mention that Paul, while preaching in Spain, converted the two sisters, Xantippe and Polixene, who were commemorated in the Greek Orthodox Church on September 23rd. Xantippe converted her husband, Philotheus, prefect of Provo, to the Christian faith, and Polixene, on the other hand, went to Achaia in Greece, where she was baptized by Andrew, the first called, although the patron of Tarragona is Saint Frutuosus, who together with Saints Augurus and Eulogius suffered martyrdom in the local amphitheater in 259 AD. The Catalans proudly assert their association with the Apostle Paul. Behind the Metropolitan Cathedral in the cloister of the 19th century Diocesan Seminary is the old chapel of the Apostle Paul, which was built, according to Tarragonian tradition, on the site of Paul's preaching in the city. 63. On the occasion of the 19th centenary celebrations of Paul's preaching to the citizens of Tarragona, a statue of the Apostle Paul was erected on the Plaza di Plazio, next to the Metropolitan Cathedral, which was constructed over the remains of the once lofty temple of Jupiter Ammon. The co-patron of Tarragona is Thecla, who is honored here annually on September 23rd, and whose right arm is said to repose in her chapel in the cathedral. In the principal sanctuary of the cathedral, the white marble front of the high altar shows 8 magnificent 12th century reliefs of scenes portraying the beautiful romance of the Apostle Paul and Thecla in Iconium in Asia Minor, a story found in the apocryphal Acts of Paul. And once again, Paul said this in Romans 15, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and to be sped on my journey there by you once I have enjoyed your company for a little. At present, however, I am going to Jerusalem with aid for the saints. ... When therefore I have completed this and have delivered to them what has been raised, I shall go on by the way of you to Spain. In Tortosa, a Roman colony 55 kilometers southwest of Tarragona on the river Ebro, a local tradition claims Paul to have founded the local church and consecrated Rufus, the son of Simon of Cyrene, Mark 15:21, Romans 16:13, as the first bishop of the city. And what is incredible to me about that is when I told you that at my home I had all of these miraculous events happen, one of which was a bobcat coming into our yard. And I thought, Lord, is there anything biblical about the bobcat? And I thought, no, I don't remember anything about a bobcat in the Bible. Well, it turns out the scientific name, part of the scientific name for a bobcat is Rufus. And Rufus means chosen of God. And this bobcat kept coming to our backyard and staying there, laying there, posing for me. I was able to go out there. It was, it wasn't as big as a mountain lion or anything, maybe half the size. But it was like a gentle kitty cat, so much so that I got up pretty close to it and took pictures of it that are smashingly like the National Geographic. And I took them with my 35mm camera at the time in our backyard, and that was before Mom died and before our beautiful home was sold off. So, quite the tragedy in my eyes, but God brought the animal that meant chosen of God to our backyard. And I thought that was stunning. And I made videos showing my pictures that are on my channel about Rufus, the bobcat, meaning chosen of God. So I'd have to go look up where they are in my video list, but you can probably type it in the search box under my name, and Elijah and Moses, under Rufus and the bobcat. So Rufus the son of Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross when he fell, meant chosen of God. So isn't that stunning? So Rufus was the son of Simon of Cyrene, who carried the cross, and he was the first bishop of the city of Tarragona. In addition to the Catalan traditions of the visit of Paul to Spain, there is an Andalusian cycle of legends maintained by the Christians in Ecija, ancient Asturias, in the province of Seville. These 16th century traditions hold that the apostle sailed from Ostia to Cadiz, which was one of the Spanish ports, and then proceeded to the Roman colony of Asturias, known as Augusta Firma. Herotheus, a citizen of Asturias, is said to have traveled to Achaia, where he was converted in Athens by Paul's preaching. Paul consecrated him first bishop of Athens, whereupon Herotheus asked the apostle to visit his native city. After his first Roman imprisonment, Paul remembered the request of Herotheus and went to Asturias. His preaching in the Forum converted many people, among them Crispin, whom he ordained bishop of Asturias. With Crispin as patron of the shoemakers, it is no coincidence that throughout the centuries, Ecija was famous all over Spain for its shoemaking. None of the local Spanish traditions can be traced to a period prior to the 8th century, and many of them emerged during the 14th century and even later. In the early 1960s, several Spanish communities celebrated the 19th centenary of the arrival of the Apostle Paul in Spain, and in 1961, the Spanish postal authorities issued a 1 peseta commemorative stamp showing El Greco's Apostle Paul with the Spanish text. It says XIX, Roman numeral, Centenario de la Venida de San Pablo a España. Now let me show you the statue of St. Paul next to the Metropolitan Cathedral in Tarragona, which honors and perpetuates the tradition of Paul's missionary journey to Spain. So it's a stunning history, and it's very much forgotten and not even spoken of. So if these people could travel clear to Spain, they could just go through the Straits of Gibraltar to the British Isles. There's no problem there. And we know that the Apostle Paul traveled all over via ship the Mediterranean Sea, and that's the route he would have taken. Let me just show you all of these routes that you can see of the Apostle Paul. And this just shows when he, went as far as Rome, and doesn't go any farther, showing that he went to Spain. As it can be seen from this map, Paul had evangelized his entire Middle Eastern neighborhood and had even entered Europe through Greece. Paul says in Romans 15:23 and 24, "But now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, I plan to go as far as one could go west, to Spain." In his ministry, Paul covered by land and sea about 10,000 miles and had spread the good news of Jesus' resurrection across the Middle East. Paul makes clear in the opening passage that he had not been to Rome previously and thus was not the founder or one of the founders of the church in Rome. That Roman Christian church was formed at Pentecost 40 days after the resurrection, the true church. But now there were staying in Jerusalem for Pentecost God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard the sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language?" Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs, we hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" It means that God reversed the curse of Babel in Jerusalem because that's where the Lord's going to dwell forever. That's the only tower temple of the Lord that's ever going to reach unto God, not the one in Babel. So, this is something I wrote in my book, actually. That's why I'm talking that off the top of my head. But those who accepted Simon Peter's message were baptized, and about 3,000 were added to their number that day in Acts 2, 5 through 12 and 41. Including the Jews and Gentile converts to Judaism from Rome, so many small Christian congregations were formed, as one can see from the different countries gathered to celebrate Pentecost. Paul writes to the Roman Christians he will be passing through Rome on his way to Spain. However, Paul is arrested when he goes to Jerusalem and spends about 2 years, 57 to 59 approximately AD, in a Roman prison in Caesarea Maritima before he's shipped off to Rome for trial before a Roman court in Acts 25. So Paul's best laid plans to go through Rome of his own volition and then on to Spain were interrupted by God. And Paul's biblical journeys after his release from prison and his martyrdom are not recorded after Luke, the author of the book of Acts, leaves him in Rome in his own rented house for 2 whole years. For 2 whole years, 60 to 62 AD, Paul stayed in Rome in his own rented house and welcomed all who came to see him. He proclaimed the kingdom of God and taught about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. Acts 28, 30 and 31. This article is saying there is no incontrovertible evidence that after Paul spent his 2 years in his rented house in Rome, that he then left for Spain. Some argue that because Paul intended to go to Spain, that he actually did go to Spain because God had put that intent into him. This is a shaky argument. Just because Paul or anyone intends to go someplace does not mean that it is God-inspired. Paul intended to go several places, but God said no. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, having been kept by the Holy Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. And that's Asia Minor, not China. When they came to the border of Mysia, which is modern-day Turkey, the Muslims took it over and renamed it Turkey after Ataturk. They tried to enter Bithynia, but the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. So they passed by Mysia and went down to Troas in Acts 16, 6 through 8. And of course, it was at Troas that God told Paul through a vision where he really wanted Paul to go, Europe, in Acts 16, 9 through 12. We have no biblical evidence that Paul left Rome after his first imprisonment and went west to Spain. But in Spain, there's a whole different story. But we do have a few ancient texts that either imply or assert that Paul did go to Spain. One of the earliest references is by Clement of Rome, which was in the other article, a co-worker with Paul who's mentioned in Philippians 4:3, which says, "Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women since they've contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life." Apparently Clement, Paul's co-laborer, became the Bishop of Rome 88 through 99 AD and is one of the earliest apostolic church fathers, men who had personally known one of the 12 apostles or Paul, whose writings survive. In Clement's letter, it says circa 70s, just circa 40 years after the resurrection and circa 20 years after Paul wrote Romans, Bishop Clement writes, "Because of jealousy and strife, Paul, by his example, pointed out the way to the prize for patient endurance. After he had been 7 times in chains and been driven into exile and been stoned, and had preached in the east and in the west, he won the genuine glory for his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world, and having reached the farthest limits of the west. Finally, when he had given his testimony before the rulers, he thus departed from the world and went to the holy place, having become an outstanding example of patient endurance." And of course, the Romans the limits of the West was Spain, and that was where the Roman emperors had many ports. And as I showed you in the other article, the farthest limits of the West at that time would have been Spain, Latin Hispania on the Atlantic Ocean. Less than 100 years after Clement, the Muratorian Canon fragment, circa 170 AD, a listing of those writings which were part of the New Testament canon at that time in Christian history, mentions as fact that Paul did go to Spain. Moreover, the Acts of all the Apostles were written in one book, Acts. For most excellent Theophilus, Luke compiled the individual events that took place in his presence, as he plainly shows by omitting the martyrdom of Peter, as well as the departure of Paul from the city of Rome when he journeyed to Spain. And let me just show you this. This is the Muratorian Canon. Cyril of Jerusalem, 315 to 386 AD, an early church theologian in Jerusalem, passes on the belief that Paul went to Spain. Paul, who from Jerusalem and even unto Illyricum fully preached the gospel and instructed even imperial Rome, and carried the earnestness of his preaching as far as Spain, undergoing conflicts innumerable and performing signs and wonders. Chrysostom, 347 to 407, Archbishop of Constantinople, apparently one of the most talented preachers in all of Christian history, records, "For after he, Paul, had been in Rome, he returned to Spain, but whether he came thence again into these parts, we know not." 2 Timothy Homily 10. We know the Archbishop in English as Chrysostom, but that is an epithet coming from the Greek, and I don't read the Greek, but Chrysostomus, meaning golden mouth, which attested to his brilliant preaching skills. Many other ancient Christian writers asserted Paul went to Spain. Jerome, 247 to 460, the ascetic in his golden years scholar who translated the 39 books of the Old Testament and the 4 Gospels in the New Testament from Hebrew and Greek into Latin, is credited as the author of the Roman Catholic Vulgate Bible. He stated that St. Paul, having been in Spain, went from one ocean to another. And that was Amos Cap 5 in that book. Whether Paul fulfilled his dream of evangelizing the East and the West as far as Spain is tradition and positive evidence from the quotes of many authors through the centuries. This writer says yes, Paul did go to Spain for several years after his first Roman imprisonment, circa 60 to 62 AD. By the time Paul returned to Rome from his missionary journey, Nero had burned Rome to the ground in July of 64 AD. The outcry among Romans was so great, Nero deflected the blame to Christians and started the imperial persecution of Christians. Paul, a soldier in his Lord's army, wrote in circa 61 to the new believers in the church he had founded in Ephesus, quote, "Take the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." Ephesians 6:17. So armed, Paul continued his missionary journeys and spread the gospel, probably even as far as Spain. Sandra Sweeney Silver. So there you go. If the Stone of Scone could wind up in the British Isles, going through the Straits of Gibraltar from Spain in that little bottleneck where the ships can go through, there's no doubt that it definitely could happen, because I believe that Paul actually indicated that he was going to Spain, and he took the gospel from the east to the west. And he was an incredible man, full of the Holy Spirit of God, and endured so much hardship that he gives me hope to endure the hardship I endure. And nothing like what he endured, of course. You know, I wasn't stoned, I wasn't whipped, and he endured much and survived it all by the power of God. And because Yeshua, Jesus, appeared on the road to Damascus, and then he went to Mount Sinai, where he spent some time, and the Lord revealed himself to him at Mount Sinai. This just shows to me that the stone of Scone could definitely have been taken by ship, by the daughters of Zedekiah, or by Scota. It's a very interesting history, and it's a very possible scenario. So the stone of Scone, the British coronation stone that's going to be under King Charles III's coronation chair, brought from Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, where the Scottish kings were all crowned upon this stone, where the Scottish crown jewels are held, will be taken from Edinburgh Castle and put underneath King Charles III's coronation chair. So if that stone is legitimately from Bethel, Jacob's pillow stone, then he would be sitting on not only David's throne, but he would be sitting on the throne of the Lord.